like to welcome you to this very interesting episode of Inside the OutHaus. And my name's Pete Smith, founder, orator, and telemarketer. And we're Inside the OutHaus would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land called Australia and their ongoing connection with land, water, and community. And we pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, elders past, present, and emerging. I'd like to just offer my thanks for the fabulous OutHaus oligarchs who keep this project running and innovative and ask all the hard questions of the outdoor sector. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to David Maskell for the introduction. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Pete. I'm just going to introduce very quickly, I guess, a colleague from the United States who's zooming in tonight at a late time from the West Coast. Jeff, how do I say it again, Jeff?
Baierlein.
Baierlein, yes, we did practice this, of course, beforehand. Jeff Baierlein from Viristar. I'm just going to give a quick bio for Jeff. Jeff has 34 years of professional experience in risk management for outdoor and experiential education programs in roles ranging from wilderness expedition leader to executive director at Outward Bound. Jeff directs the consultancy Viristar, providing safety curriculum, design and strategy consulting, and training to wilderness, outdoor, and travel-based programs worldwide. He's the author of Risk Management for Outdoor Programs, a guide to safety in outdoor education, recreation, and adventure. And there's a huge further detail of Jeff's background, but we might let him introduce and fill in some of the blanks there himself. Welcome, Jeff, to Inside the OutHaus. And my first question this afternoon or this evening, depending on your location, is can you give a very brief background on Viristar and how you got to this position?
Sure. Happy to, David. And thanks for having me on Inside the OutHaus, you and Pete. And it's nice to see everybody who's here, and glad to be participating in the conversation and sharing some ideas with you. I am, as David mentioned, I'm in the U.S., and up by the Canadian border in Washington State in the northwest part of the USA. Heard a lot about Australia, never been there. I understand, it's on the southern hemisphere. So what I learned as a kid is that it's sort of everyone's sort of upside down because it's the southern hemisphere and the blood rushes to your head, and there's kangaroos that you box, and that's kind of all I know about Australia and risk management. So I'm interested to learn more and eventually someday come to Australia and spend some time with you all. But my background started in the outdoors. As a kid, my family was an outdoors kind of family, and we went hiking before I could walk, and spent time backpacking and canoeing as a young kid with my family, and then ended up going to a summer camp, which is a nature camp and a tripping camp. And so as a teenager was leading backpacking and canoeing expeditions when I was 16, 17 years old, and had no idea about anything in terms of safety or quality or curriculum or anything like that. But we had a good time and everyone survived. And then ended up studying outdoor and environmental education in college and working for Outward Bound for about 10 years in North America, starting out as an assistant instructor and ending up moving into management. And I was also teaching wilderness medical courses as well from time to time, and coming over to East Asia to do that, and got to know some outdoor programs in Hong Kong and Vietnam and Taiwan. And they said, oh, so you do outdoor stuff and you do medical rescue things, you must know about risk management. So come talk to us about risk management. And so I started giving short presentations, kind of wondering why they were asking me, but they thought I knew stuff. And that kind of evolved where they said, well, come back next year and we'll do a 2-day thing. We'll bring in all these people and we'll pay for your flight. And so I did that. And I said, well, this was great. And you should write a book about risk management for outdoor programs. And I said, okay, well, so I did that. And it just got all busier and busier with different people hearing about this sort of stuff that we were doing, and had a client in Vietnam that wanted us to incorporate for tax reasons in Vietnam. It was cheaper for them to hire a company than a person. So we did that. And then I ended up leaving the day job and doing this full time starting about 4 years ago. And it's been a real pleasure to be working with different outdoor programs, mostly around risk management, but also around pedagogy and curriculum design and those sorts of things as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeff, for that great summary. Full disclosure from the OutHaus, and we'll do a bit of a promotion for ourselves afterwards. We've actually partnered with Viristar and with Jeff's organization, and to offer Jeff's courses online, which I was a participant student of back in December. I felt that I had a gap in my currency of my knowledge about risk management, and jumped into the program in my role as a coordinator of Outdoor at a independent school, and found that, yes, there was a major gap within what I'd been trained 20, 25 years ago when I was coming through a diploma course in the vet system here in Australia, and the current thinking having moved on and evolved. Jeff, do you want to speak to that in terms of the evolution of risk management and the current thinking away from the ideals of just having a risk management matrix and a spreadsheet and a big Word document to more systems thinking? And I know that's a massive topic, but if you could just unpack that for the audience, and then we'll move on.
Sure. If we have 20 hours, I'd be happy to walk everyone through it. But in summary, basically over the last 100 years, organizations and companies and governments have been asking themselves, why do incidents occur? Why do accidents happen? And therefore, how do we prevent them? And back in the 1930s, there was a guy, Herbert Heinrich, who in 1931 published a book called Industrial Accident Prevention. And this was very influential. And he said, accidents happen because of a series of dominoes. You have a precipitating factor, which causes something else to happen, which causes something else to happen. And then boom, you have your incident. And so all you need to do is pull out one of the dominoes in this chain, and you stop the incident from happening. And so time passes, and people recognize that, well, incident causation is a little bit more complex than that. And you may have heard of the Swiss cheese model by James Reason, who published in the 1990s, who talked about a latent factor and then some precipitating event. This is the epidemiological model. And so you need to create barriers and defenses. And an incident only happens when some kind of hazard is able to penetrate or go over or around the barriers and defenses that you've created. So this is also sort of a linear model. And then in the 1990s, people started looking at systems like nuclear power plants that are really complicated. There's lots of people, there's lots of technology, there's lots of interaction, there's lots of different things going on. And they said, these linear models don't really help us understand how to stop radiation from leaking out of these nuclear power plants. We need a more complex model that incorporates the people element and the technology element. And this was the advent of complex socio-technical systems theory, or systems thinking is a way that some people shorten it. And the idea here is that in a complex system, like a lead outdoor activity, a group of people bushwalking or doing something outdoors, that's considered just as complex as a nuclear power plant for the purposes of risk management and incident prevention. There are a number of different risks, and they can combine in unpredictable ways to lead to an incident. So you can think of kind of a cloud of different risks, and they're going to interact in a way we can't predict at a time that we can't anticipate in advance, and involving people and circumstances that we don't know what it's going to be, and that's going to lead to an incident. And so rather than having this simple model of a domino theory, it's this very, there's going to be a breakdown in our safety system. We just don't know where or when or how or who's going to be involved or what's going to be involved, equipment and people. And so what we need to do is we need to build a resilient system that when there is a breakdown, make sure that the system doesn't have a catastrophic failure. And so this is the idea of systems thinking applied to risk management for outdoor programs or nuclear power generation or the medical field or aerospace or anywhere. It's the same theoretical model of incident causation applied to any industry in any field. But the idea is you want backup systems, you want redundancy, you want people trained to a higher level than they normally would need to operate at, like a class 4 paddler who is paddling at class 3. So if there is an incident and they need to start moving around really quickly in the rapids and rescuing someone, they still have that margin of safety and comfort operating in that white water. Having resilient staff, having basically extra resilience to your system so that when an accident occurs, it doesn't lead to a complete breakdown. And so this is a really different way of thinking about things, this idea of complex socio-technical systems theory. And I should say that in my experience, the people who are doing the most to advance this idea in the lead outdoor activity sector worldwide are in Australia. And there are people like Claire Dallett, Paul Salmon, Natasha Good, Tony Carden, folks you may know who are doing work at the Center for Human Factors and Socio-Technical Systems at the University of Sunshine Coast. And they're doing research and publishing stuff that is really globally leading about how to understand complex systems like lead outdoor activities and build a risk management scheme that mimics the complexity of the actual system. The idea is your risk management system's complexity has to mimic the complexity of the system that it's trying to manage. So it has to have a lot of complexity. And so one of the things that folks at the University of Sunshine Coast are saying is that risk assessment spreadsheets, probabilistic risk assessment spreadsheets where you have a chart and you list, okay, here are the 10 different things. We could have severe weather, we could have equipment breakdown, we have a kid who doesn't follow directions and so on. And for every risk, we maybe assign a probability and a severity to that risk and then a control measure. And then we as a provider hand that off to the school, and the school says, okay, well, clearly you know what you're doing in terms of risk management. Why don't you take our kids out for a week of bushwalking and co-steering and whatever else it might be? But the reality is that those risk assessment spreadsheets represent a linear, an old-fashioned, simplistic model of incident causation. There's a risk, you control it, boom, and you're done. And it doesn't do a good job of managing for an unpredictable combination of risk factors that combine and lead to an incident. And let me just give you one example with airlines, commercial airlines. It's where a lot of risk management happens because when a commercial airplane crashes, it's a big deal. And so often plane crashes have to do with pilot error plus equipment failure plus some kind of severe weather, fog or poor visibility or something like that. And all three of those combined. But it's hard to tell what kind of pilot error. Is it going to be poor communication between the pilot and the first officer? Or is it going to be someone's drowsy or intoxicated or not trained well enough or has a psychiatric problem or what is, and then what's the equipment breakdown? What's the type of severe weather? All those different things. And so you have to build a resilient system where you're addressing all these different pieces and making sure you have backup systems, multiple really highly trained staff, multiple flight computers and so on, multiple ways of looking at environmental conditions with sensors and weather stations and radio reports and all that kind of stuff. And you have this whole resilient system with lots of different layers, and that is what helps that airplane not end up crashing in a fog bank into into the ocean. So that's just a little bit of kind of the theory of incident causation, and risk assessment spreadsheets are an important part of dealing with basic risks like traffic and lightning and a person not being trained and certified to run an abseil site, for example. So they're really, really important to address those frontline risks. But if we want to address some of these other major incidents that spring out of an unpredictable combination of factors, we have to add another layer of sophistication into our risk management process. And this is something that we talk a lot about with groups, and in a lot of parts of the world, like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, the UK, people are really focused on risk assessment. So our encouragement is, yes, they're great for when you're doing a new activity, working with a new population, you're going to a new geography, there's some sort of change, like there's a pandemic and you need to assess the risks of the pandemic and its evolving severity. But in order to address these complex risks, you need to have a whole different layer of thinking, which is this systems thinking idea.
So thanks for that amazingly good summary of a really complex part of the course. And I might just share a little bit about my experience in the course. The platform was amazing. It's all online. It's all via Zoom. Jeff runs 2 different start times, one that's good for sort of East Coast USA, and then a start time that's good for Singapore time zone. So folks in Australia and New Zealand and in other parts of the Southern Hemisphere potentially. And the interaction was very much like what we're doing here on Zoom, lots of group discussions, breakout rooms, but then there'd be homework, which was actually having to go away and work in small groups, again with Zoom, watching videos of role-playing, and not sort of cliched role-playing, but you know, well-written scripts that seem very relevant to today's industry and the sector that we currently find ourselves in, topical content, including COVID, protocols and procedures. And the takeaways that I got from the 4 weeks was definitely around the fact that whilst I have a good system in place of risk management plans using spreadsheets and a matrix for those, you know, causal effects, there's no replacing the fact that I'm a one-man operation. So I'm out this week with COVID. Nothing's happening as a result because there's no one to replace me. So there's no redundancy in my role this week. So everything that was planned for this week stops, as an example. So in a bigger picture for me running upcoming programs, if suddenly I was out because of a COVID protocol, yeah, what would be the alternatives? What would be the backup plan, and what's the systems for that? What it focused on me was very much within my organization. We need to be thinking the whole of the organization, not just the out the red department and the out the red programs that I'm delivering, but all the other factors and all the other sub departments that contribute to the delivery of my programming. Does anyone have any questions?
With this sort of brains trust in the room, I'm sorry, I've gone off video because I would have a dodgy internet connection, but this is Pete. Listen, there must be some great questions for Jeff around what he said. So let's throw it open to people to ask Jeff some questions.
David, you got your hand up?
Yes, it's interesting, Jeff, that you were talking about people like Tony Carden. He's actually moved on from that area, although he's still in risk management. He's joined WorkSafe Victoria.
Right.
Yeah, so still in the same area. I talk to him occasionally. You're aware of our National Adventure Activity Standard and Good Practice Guide system? Yeah, it always interests me, like you just stated, basically, that we had some of the world's best risk managers, yeah? And yeah, we probably the adventure activity, the AAS and its good practice guides are as good as anything in the world. We're probably the first to do that type of thing. And yet in Australia, we tend to think we're not very good and we keep looking overseas. And, you know, to other places for some of our risk management. So it's sort of, to me, it's refreshing to think that, well, we should be looking overseas as well, that we're actually doing quite well here. Is that probably a reasonable statement?
I think that's really accurate, David. I think Australia is doing a really, really good job with risk management relative to its global neighbors, because you have the Australian Adventure Activity Standard and the good practice guides. That's really helpful. You have organizations like the Outdoor Council of Australia, and then also the state level bodies that are advocating for outdoor programming and quality and standards. So Lori Modi and others are working to elevate the industry. You have the outdoor education integrated into primary, secondary education in terms of like GSCEs or the curriculum, as well as vocational training, like through the TAFE program. There are a variety of standards in terms of being checked off for different activities and first aid and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of infrastructure that Australia has that, for example, India, where we do some work, doesn't have. They just don't have. They have some basic occupational health and safety laws, and a couple states like Maharashtra are working on adventure safety regulations and the like, but they just don't have the infrastructure, and they don't have the kind of I think Australia and New Zealand, when there's an incident happen, people pay close attention. If a tree branch falls on somebody at a campground, the organization is going to really think hard about what's our institutional response. How do we deal with this? It gets in the newspaper, and different outdoor programs around the country are thinking about it, and years go by and people still remember and refer to that incident. Whereas in, say, Cambodia, if someone has a zip line accident, just life sort of continues on, and there's not that larger social lower risk tolerance and the kind of the whole of the nation response around how do we think about a critical incident and how do we improve what we're doing. So I think Australia is a global leader. And I think there are a couple other places that I think are also in that top tier. And one of them is New Zealand, and another is the UK. And what they have is they have statutory guidance around risk management. So the AAAS is voluntary. So that means the best organizations like the Outdoor Education Group, they're going to meet those standards. But some smaller organization that's really stressed for money and really struggling, they may hire someone who doesn't quite qualify. They may not follow all the rules. They might not have all the documentation. Whereas in a place like New Zealand or the UK, where the law says you have to meet these standards and you have to go through a third-party audit. And there are some loopholes, with schools and with horseback riding programs in New Zealand and so on. But for a lot of adventure activities, it's required by law, and you have a third party come in and check. And I think that the research, people like Tony Carden, who have done research on regulatory regimes and conformist regimes, the research indicates that having that third party, and ideally in a compulsory way, that really influences safety. The other country that comes to my mind is Singapore, where the country really focuses on outdoor adventure education. Singapore is a small country, and they see outdoor adventure education as existentially important to the organization, building resilience in the youth population. And it's connected to kind of the military, the Singapore Armed Forces, and kind of the idea of we're small, there's a lot of other big players in the area, and we need to be tough and resilient as an organization. So they passed a master plan for outdoor adventure education in, I think, 2016, saying every kid in their grade school years goes through 3 multi-day outdoor adventure education experiences: kayaking, ropes course, bicycling, hiking, all that kind of stuff, and the government pays for it. And so it's very stable of a system, and there's bits and pieces to work on. But I think Singapore is a global leader in terms of the government saying this is really important. We see the value in it, and we're going to put a whole lot of money towards it. And we're going to create a national plan that says every kid who is in the public school system goes through multiple multi-day outdoor education experiences. So I think Australia is great, and I hold it up in the classes as a global exemplar. And there are also other countries that are doing a lot of really exciting things in this space as well.
Alan, jump in with your question.
That we've still got a way to go. Thank you.
So I'm coming from South Africa, Jeff, where we are still in the process of trying to get systems in place that are governmentally recognized when it comes to risk management in the outdoors. I've now moved to Zambia, where we are the only outdoor center in the whole country. And it's not even recognized, as in there's no legal framework around it. And we are basing ourselves on UK guidelines when it comes to risk management and the qualifications that we need for the instructors to be able to run programs. But I'm currently dealing with a situation where we have now had 2 instructors who have an Adventure Activities Licensing Authority certification on a certain activity, and they cannot swim.
Wow.
And I've been told it's common practice. And now I'm sitting here trying to say, how on earth do we get international instructors in based on their qualifications, and this certain qualification which we require in 2 instances in the last 6 months now has been invalid. When they get here and we do an internal assessment, the one couldn't swim at all, and the second one has, in his own words, is very uncertain on water.
But they had AALA certification on a non-water activity, like abseiling.
So they've got certification on paddling, signed off, risk training done, and everything. And neither of them can swim properly. One cannot swim at all, and the other one is not confident in the water.
Wow. Wow.
And I'm sitting here going, where on earth do we even start?
Yeah. Yeah. It's, you know, it's a wonderful challenge, Alan, you have in front of you, and a real adventure for you to figure out how to do this. You know, I think of places like Hong Kong, where maybe 30, 40 years ago or so, Outward Bound came in and started doing programs when it was still a British colony. And there was not a culture of outdoor recreation, or certainly outdoor education back then. And so, it wasn't that you could hire somebody that had an undergraduate degree in outdoor adventure education and say, okay, great, you know, go through 2 weeks of training to learn where our gear is and blah, 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 and off you go. And they set up a 6-month training program. And Outward Bound Singapore also has a 6-month training program. And they have some universities like Republic Polytechnic where you can get a degree in outdoor adventure education, so on. But both of them said, we need to start from the very beginning. This is a rope. This is a carabiner. This is this thing called rock climbing. You may or may not have seen it on TV or whatever. And so we're going to, you know, start from the very beginning. And that's a very different approach than a lot of places where you hire in folks who have, you know, years of experience, maybe working in a tripping camp or some other outdoor program, or have a degree, you know, or something like that. But that's also very expensive to spend 6 months training somebody up. So it becomes a really interesting challenge. In the short term, maybe you just, you strap a PFD on them and don't let them take it off. But I think
so. Yeah, I mean, we have an instructor training program which we do over 2 years here to bring in local Zambians. Yeah. But they really are coming from, you know, absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
But our challenge is then to see if we can get them international qualifications over and above that after the 2 years, so they can be signed off and then go anywhere in the world.
Right.
But it's a huge cost. I mean, just to give an example, we're 20 to 1 when it comes to exchange rate with the dollar. So you can imagine what we are with the pound.
Right.
And there's not a culture here. So tour guiding and outdoor adventure activities are seen as being right at the bottom of the employment desirability things.
Right. Right.
So it's a challenge. So we have in the past really heavily relied on external or outside people, and bringing them in and paying them and getting them here on 2-year contracts. But unfortunately, what it does is it leaves such a high staff turnover that you have very little. You're always training. You're always getting new people in. You're always starting again from scratch. And we're sitting here and saying, how on earth can we get this recognized within Zambia, formally accredited somewhere with the Zambian Qualifications Authority, and then say, let's get Zambians doing it.
Right, right. That would be great, and I think it is a really smart thing to do in the interim before there is an indigenous scheme with qualifications and training centers and so on to bring in expats. I mean, that's how China has been doing it for a long time and still is doing it, is bringing in people with qualifications from Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, and then they kind of maybe get partnered with a local Chinese person who doesn't have all that kind of stuff to lead some paddling trip somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah. My limited sense of the work in South Africa is that some folks there see adventure tourism, which isn't outdoor ed, but related, as a big cash cow. Not so much in the last couple of weeks, but some of the credentialing and the training has to do around in the last couple of years. It hasn't been, but safaris and that sort of thing. And so training, safari guides, that's where, and in India, that's where you've started to see investment, because the Indian government officials want the tourist dollars. And so they start developing infrastructure for the international tourist industry around safety requirements and accreditation schemes and that sort of thing, and government funding to support various initiatives. And then that can trickle out to outdoor experiential education and that sort of thing. But in a place like Zambia, there's so many other pressing needs around literacy and emergency medicine and dealing with anything else that there's probably limited energy towards, developing a lucrative adventure tourism industry.
Yeah, I mean, there's very little. So in Zambia, there's whitewater rafting on the Zambezi, and then there's us. I mean, to find someone here who does rock climbing is impossible. It's not an activity done in Zambia. Whereas in the rest of the world, it's, or certainly in other places, it's okay, that's easy. But I know in South Africa, the challenge is that there's a lot of politics involved, both, politics in the framework of government and politics within the adventure industry itself, as to who's running it and who's setting standards and who's going to be the kingpin and have their say, which is quite sad, because it ends up things are undermining all the time. And there's tourism standards, but the outdoor adventure education side doesn't want to fall under tourism. They prefer to go under education. And then you have all sorts of education says, we don't want to host you. It's tourism. And tourism says, we don't understand education. You are... So it's it will settle down one day, but unfortunately, in the process, there's been a couple of drownings and a few other things in South Africa that have made national news and really affected the outdoor education industry in major ways.
Yeah.
Here it's as you said earlier, if something happens in Zambia, it's just something happens. You don't. We've got a fairly good safety record. We haven't had anyone die on us, for want of a horrible saying. But yeah, it's not that whole risk management and the consequences of it is still growing or developing.
Right.
And in some ways, it'll be how can we pioneer it? Because there's lots of places in Africa that are involved in not necessarily outdoor education, but church camps, and they're sending kids away for the weekend and into the bush and that. And there is an overlap on that side, I think, in the countries around us, Mozambique, Angola, Zambia, Uganda, and so on, where we can link to more than, I think, directly with tourism.
Oh, and that's such an interesting story. It feels like a large mountain that you're having to climb in terms of development, but best of luck.
Thank you.
Does other people have any questions around this subject? I really threw one in the chat and I'm quite interested in that. But if other people have other questions, then let's ask them.
I did have a question, if I could. Jeff, just looking at what you've spoken there, and it is interesting getting Alan's view as what's happening, say, in a different country, whereas here in Australia, we've got a very complex, there's complex complications or complex outcomes that come from the issues from risk management because of the complexity of the legal requirements, or even from civil law applications. I'm going to put a question from putting my insurance hat on, and given that we're looking at an industry which we're almost looking is as full of that complex risk sort of approach, how would you suggest we approach as our industry to insurers if we've got businesses that can't demonstrate their current compliance with what you call the linear thinking controls, the important frontline risks? What faith should we have in those businesses that they are able to manage the more complex ones?
Right. Well,
I thought of a nice way of asking that question, but by the time I got to asking it, there isn't one.
Well, let me respond, and then you tell me if I'm kind of heading in a useful direction. In my understanding is that adventure activity standard started in, I think, Victoria some years ago because of insurance affordability issues, and then every state harmonized their systems because outdoor programs are traveling across states and borders, and it made sense to have a uniform system, and that ought to help insurance companies feel confident. I think the Uploads project that was put into the chat area by Pete, I think that's a wonderful tool for insurance companies to be aware of, because then you can statistically say, if you have good convincing data, and it's a voluntary system at this point to submit your data, but the more people that submit, the better, the more compelling the data set will be, that, hey, our experience of loss is relatively little, and something like cheerleading or playing football or rugby is actually more dangerous than a well-organized rock climbing or bushwalking expedition, even though people think, oh, bushwalking, well, there's snakes and there's funnel web spiders or whatever they might say. In reality, a well-run institutional rock climbing program, a top rope program, the most dangerous part of it by far is driving on the road to get to the climbing site. And climbing is actually very low risk, but insurance agents, they don't recognize that. But insurance companies respond to numbers, and so my sense is that they respond to numbers and predictability. So if they have a large set of data around insuring outdoor programs and they see that the losses are low, then that's going to help the premiums come down. That's going to help people become more comfortable with quoting because they can figure out what the rates are. So that's, and so I think having the standards, having assembling incident information, all those sorts of things are helpful. And then maybe educating the insurance industry as much as possible. And this is maybe something more for the Lori Modis of the world, but, have an invitational and take a bunch of people from the Insurance Association of Australia rock climbing and show them that, we can do this and it's really well structured and very safe and that kind of thing. But it is a challenge. I don't think there's any super easy answers, but I would think that it would be easier in Australia because because there's a lot of good risk management structure in place than in some other places, like Zambia, for example. The other thing that comes to my mind is what New Zealand has in place, which is the accident compensation scheme, which is basically like a workers' compensation system. It's a no-fault sort of thing. So if somebody gets injured on an adventure activity, the government just writes a check, and you can't sue the company unless there's gross negligence or something like that. The government just writes a check and takes care of it, and so that has really reduced the fear factor for organizations of these major crippling losses. And because it's like a government-run workers' compensation scheme, it's fairly straightforward. So again, this would be probably a long process of lobbying the government to look at New Zealand's Accident Compensation Corporation, the legislation they passed, I think in 2001, and it gets updated every so often, and see if that's something that Australia might be interested in. I think Australia is a little bit more libertarian than New Zealand, so it might be a big step in the lobbying. The insurance company might not want to lose all those premiums, but my sense is that it works out well in New Zealand.
Yeah, I think there's two issues there. Is that the government question's an interesting one, but I think the insurance companies have already demonstrated they're more than happy to lose those insurance premiums because they're not quoting anybody. So we're seeing insurers leave the market at a great rate of knots. So I guess we're looking at risk management being, something that we can tether to the insurance company. So you mentioned things like education and third-party sign-off. That's the type of approach that the insurers are, the only reason that they'll look to play. So that's why I asked the question that if these operators can't demonstrate their capability on those important frontline risks, because the complexity of risk, where the real exposure is in the volatility of those compounding issues, because that's when something catastrophic typically occurs.
Mm-hmm.
I'll throw in there. Paul's been a presenter in the OutHaus 2 years ago now, and again with Outdoors New South Wales and various Zoom discussions on this area. Does the room think that a course like the Viristar risk management course would help establish a level or a bar for Australian outdoor sector and the market to help the industry or the insurance industry come back into the marketplace, because they can recognize that XYZ camp has a Viristar accreditation?
I think even beyond Australia, I'd certainly like to make use of it in Zambia. where we really are pioneering more than anything else.
I think we should be looking at all options, as we develop systems to get the outdoor industry to work together, and I think if we all work together, the solutions will happen. The biggest thing that's kept us from succeeding really well over the last few decades is everyone playing in their own little area. The outdoor educators over here, the tourism people over here, all of the different groups. We're slowly, but we're not quite agreeing that we should all be a single industry. Once we agree we're all a single industry, then things like accreditation, the programs we're talking about here, they'll all have value until such time as we get that industry thing sorted out, which we could do pretty quickly. We won't make.
Why do you think the move to the single industry, David, is so slow in coming, or other people in the room?
Laurie?
It's a very good question, Peter, and I'm really keen to hear the answer, because one of the responses is really following on from Jeff's statement, is that volume for insurers, volume of premium is what's going to cover that that extreme risk. And we just, by segmenting it, we don't have the volume. The amusement industry is an extremely volatile area. And they've just been told now by the federal government they're not prepared to go with the DMF, which was, really hurting. So, yeah, lots of challenges. It would be very interesting to have an answer to that question. I'm very keen to hear it.
Colin, jump in there, mate.
Yeah,
I'll say goodbye to. Oh, sorry, wrong person.
Okay. I'm just thinking about where best to get leverage. Very difficult to get some leverage to the government overall, but we do have an accreditation framework already for adventure activity providers and hardtop operators. So I think it would be very much worthwhile in conversations at that level for quality tourism framework, because it's an obvious place to go where the conversation should be welcomed.
And I think in New Zealand, the tourism industry, Aotearoa, has collaborated with the outdoor adventure sector, and so they're, I think everyone who's doing outdoor adventure stuff, whether it's tourism or outdoor education, seems to be collaborating. But there's a smaller country; it's maybe a little bit more tight knit. Culturally, it's a little more maybe communitarian, a little bit less libertarian than Australia. Perhaps you likely know better than I. But you're right, Colin. There is an accreditation framework and a check-off system already, and camps are part of that, and so that's very close. And my sense is that if there were a system that were a checkoff with a third-party audit, so some other party coming in to do a hands-on inspection of your program and your equipment and your certifications on file and observing activities, that would really help. And it would help if it were compulsory. So the insurance agency is not going to think, well, there's some people that are doing it right, but I'm also going to be asked to quote some people that are cutting corners, and it's really hard to tell who's doing what. And that's sort of the system that exists in Australia and the UK, and that may help. But that's, that means you're giving up control, and you have this third-party audit, and people like to have their freedom and do what they want, and so it's not always easy to get people to submit to some kind of safety audit system, and they're hard to do well, and it costs a lot of money, and it's going to cost you money to basically fund a third-party auditing system and that sort of thing, or someone's got to pay for it, and that's a real challenge in even in New Zealand, where they're really committed to it.
David, you had another comment?
Yeah, look, I think that part of the problem, of course, is old people like me that have been around too long. I'm probably a bit more flexible than some, maybe not physically anymore, but mentally. But there is a lot of opposition to working together that people like ourselves have got to lobby some of the people that don't want to be a part of a bigger thing, want to keep their own little worlds. With things like accreditation, I think many of our current accreditation systems, the ATAP and the Camps Association, for instance, started off with really good intentions. In fact, I was involved in starting both of them, particularly the ATAP one that started way back in the Vitoa days, maybe 30 years ago, but they lost their way. I don't quite believe in either of those accreditation systems at the moment. We had to recently argue to get them to include the adventure activity standards in, because they hadn't even noticed that they were happening as a national document. So there's potential there, but we've got to make these things valid. They've got to be real, not just bits of paper.
And that being said, I think forums like this, I still look at the topics that Inside the OutHaus runs, on a pretty regular basis. The dissemination of information, access to programs like yours. Like, I'm keen to get my risk management team here to get involved and learn from it. The sharing of information in Australia, in our outdoor community is actually very good. Through various forums, that the information is there. We've just got to get people to actually want to do it, because typically they're the same people tapping into a lot of things. David, stop laughing.
It's very true. Jeff, we're coming up to the end of our allocated hour, and I want to be respectful of your time in the States and everyone else's time here on a Monday afternoon. If you could, and we're still open to more questions for sure if you've got more questions, but I'm always aware that risk management sometimes is seen to be a management responsibility. So you're a program coordinator, you're the area manager, you're the camp director. Elevator pitch for why this is relevant to a field staff, because we have field staff in the room. We have lots of people who employ field staff, so instructors, facilitators, adventurous journey activity leaders. So can you give us a bit of a viewpoint on that area within Viristar's range of courses?
Yeah, well, so we got asked to do risk management training for these outdoor programs in East Asia was where we got started. And, and eventually when I'd been going there for a few years and doing these multi-day trainings, and someone said, write a book. I said, okay. So I came back home and sat down at my dining room table and started typing. And, 6 months later, I looked at what I had created and I recognized this is a lot of management stuff. And what I realized is that 80% of risk management happens at the administrative level, which is why Viristar's principal training product, this 40-hour online training program, we only market it towards administrators. We don't have a training product for field staff, because we recognize that most of risk management happens with the people that are setting the corporate culture, with the people that are writing policies and procedures manuals, with the people that are developing budgets for equipment management, the people that are setting expectations around, do we have certificated people, the people that are creating emergency response plans, all that kind of stuff. And those are administrative functions. And once you get to the quote sharp end, where there's the actual practitioner in the field who's holding the belay or setting the climb or that sort of thing, a lot of risk management is already baked into the system at that point. And so I think that's important to recognize, that if there is an accident, you don't want to blame the practitioner when the person, there's a caving incident or a motor vehicle accident or something like that. You want to look at the broader overarching systems and the management aspects of things when you're thinking about incident causation. That said, it's really, really important that your staff are in an environment where there's a positive safety culture, where you say, hey, safety is important to us, and we want to be a learning organization. So if you do make a mistake, write it up on an incident report, and we won't reflexively punish you for acknowledging your mistake. We're going to see it as a learning opportunity, and we're going to give you really great gear. We're going to give you enough time off so you have time to rest in between trips. We're going to offer you professional development opportunities. We're going to try to create as sustainable system as possible, so that outdoor education isn't something that people do for 3 years in their early 20s and then they go off and get a real job where they can afford to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend and a house and all those other nice things. But it's more of something that people can do for a long time. Folks like David, who have been outdoor educator for years, are an exemplar of someone who's figured out how to make it a career. So I think it is important, but a lot of what we try to do in our course is to work with the administrators of an outdoor program to help them understand the science behind incident causation and to help them develop the skills and the knowledge so that they can support their field staff by having a really positive safety culture where safety is a value we don't just talk about, but we live, by having great training, by having good gear, by having good route plans, by all the supports that field staff need in order to be successful.
Great. There's a couple of, thanks for that, Jeff. There's a question from Rob in the chat. Unless Rob wants to read it out, I'll just go straight in. To state the obvious, I'd imagine that the state system is a significant factor limiting the capacity to form a united industry in Australia. So the state-based system here. Ideally, we'd keep some autonomy for each state, yet work together on the issues that impact on a national level. How is this navigated in the US of A?
I don't encourage you to use the USA as a model for teamwork and collaboration. I said that Australia is a little bit more libertarian and freedom focused than your neighbors in New Zealand, which can come together and create legislation around gun safety when there's a major shooting incident, or outdoor safety when there's a drowning, or that kind of thing. The US is on the far, we're cowboys, we love freedom and independence, and we're not going to be tied down. So we don't have very good systems here. And this is why I love talking about what Australia has developed. We have, some great universities, some great thought leaders. You can get a PhD in outdoor education here. And there are some innovations, like the Association for Experiential Education has a high quality accreditation scheme, but it's voluntary. There are very few organizations that have been part of it. There's some big outdoor programs that are active here and the like. But in terms of collaboration, I would look to New Zealand, because I think they do it so well. And I don't know what's in the water over there, but they're able to solve problems as a unit better than most nations are.
David, did you have another comment?
Yeah, I think what we need to do is support the state peak bodies who are working to strengthen the Outdoor Council of Australia to really achieve in the next few years exactly what Rob saying needs to happen. Yeah, and that's more a focus on a national management system of all our programs, risk management, the whole thing. The actual way it'll end up, I don't know, but I'm confident that we're heading in that direction. But we need to support people like Andrew, Laurie, and Dom because they're the key players that will make that happen.
Thanks, David. Let's just hear from Colin. You have your hand up. Can we hear what you question or a comment?
Sorry, I didn't put it down earlier.
No, that's no worries. Well, that is a good segue. What a great chat. Thanks very much to Jeff Baierlein from Viristar for coming into the room and sharing his knowledge and wisdom with the room. Thank you all for sharing your knowledge and wisdom on this topic. And I think we could probably chat about it for another at least 10 hours. great stories from all around the world. If you missed this, then you can catch it on the recording. And we're going to stop that right now. Feel free to stay and have a chat if you want. But otherwise, till next time, this is Pete signing off.